evening of the 21st of December 1988 at about 7 o'clock, all hell broke loose here where I'm standing, because the kerosene-filled wing of Pan Am 103 slammed into the ground right here and exploded. It sent a fireball hundreds of feet into the air. It threw 1,500 tons of soil and rubble and smashed masonry over there, blocking the roads, filling people's gardens. Aluminium rained from the sky. Gas turbines plunged to earth and buried themselves around the town. And hundreds of people ended their flights, not in New York, as expected, but in amongst those houses, smashed through roofs, in through windows, wrapped around lampposts, into fences and hedges, lying in people's gardens. And townspeople were snuffed out in the blink of an eye, right here, without ever knowing why or what hit them. Absolute carnage visited on this town, with no warning and no reason. So who was first to come and deal with it? Well, here, two of them tell their story very candidly. Two pairs of those boots on the ground, with no punches pulled. I was going to say I'm joined by, but I'm not, because I've done the joining, because I'm hundreds of miles from home. Two really fascinating chaps. Steve, who I've known for 25 years.
Yeah, since the Bluebird.
Since the Bluebird project,
yeah.
Who you may have seen on programmes like Air Crash Investigation. And Andy, who I've not known for 25 years.
25 days, maybe.
25 days, who you might have seen on other programmes, such as Air Crash Investigation. And last time I was here, we had a good old chat about, because you guys were senior investigators of accidents.
Senior inspectors of air accidents.
Senior inspectors of air accidents.
That's our official title.
Brackets engineering, just to be pedantic.
Yeah. Brackets engineering at the Air Accident Investigation Branch in Farnborough, otherwise known as the Branch. And what's even more intriguing is that you were both at Lockerbie,
yeah,
which has been quite topical this year. I've got a really boring story. I was at home living at my parents' house. I was a 19-year-old youth, and I came down the stairs and it said something bad had happened to Lockerbie. And I only knew it because I used to go fishing up on the Clyde, and I could drive there by the time I was 19. So I'd drive up through Brampton, Longtown, past Gretna, and then there'd be a sign for Lockerbie, and it was just a waypoint on my pilgrimage to go fishing. But I knew what it was, and Lockerbie, I've heard of that. Of course, I've been across it ever since. But I mean, what were you guys doing when it all hit the fan? Were you having your tea?
Putting the kids to bed, I was. At that point,
I was watching the Les Dawson Christmas show. Always was a favourite comedian, and that's something I sat down deliberately to watch, and that programme was interrupted by a news flash.
For our next programme, we're going over to the newsroom and Nicholas Witchell.
Good evening. There's been a major air crash tonight near the Scottish border. A Pan-American jumbo jet carrying more than 250 people has crashed near the town of Lockerbie in Dumfries.
Oh, so you saw a news flash? That was your first?
Yes.
So they hadn't rang you from the branch on radio?
I think I got a call from Dave King.
Within a few seconds of that, I got a call from the same Dave King saying that something has broken up, seemed to break up in the air over Lockerbie, or over the Lowther Hills. Lockerbie wasn't mentioned at that point on the official notification. So then, I presume it was dash off to the branch, or did you wait for further instruction?
I think we might have had, I can't remember, because I lived lived so close. It was not a big problem to go into the branch and pick up kit rather than keep it at home. Right. But I think I already had a lot of it at home.
I think I had a lot. I have no recollection of going to the branch, but I was told to go and join a special flight put on by Pan Am in one of what must have been the original Boeing 727s at Heathrow. And I know I had with me one of the brand new mobile phones, which are the size of a breeze block. And that was a real impediment to me then and subsequently out in the field. But I remember getting to the Pan Am facility at Heathrow, and from there I was guided onto the aeroplane. So I actually got on from the air side, not from the passenger side.
Right, because I did wonder, I know you'd gone in a 727, I was going to say where did that come from, but it was Pan Am's aircraft. So that they flew you to Carlisle?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I flew to Carlisle many times. I was always in helicopter, so I never used the runway, but I saw it a lot. And it wasn't the greatest, so middle of the night.
Well, my recollection was that Carlisle had a runway a bit longer than my mother's allotment.
Yeah,
and
that's the same Carlisle.
Yeah, and the captain, when he came on the PA, he said, "Well, buckle up. This is going to be a real hard landing." So, God, we did buckle up. Well, I did anyway. And we turned off, and you could just see the stoplights glaring at us through the windows.
I'm sure it must be the biggest aircraft that's actually flown in there, except I think that RF Hercules can get in occasionally. Yeah. But that was probably the heaviest and fastest aircraft.
So you put the kids to bed, you've missed the Les Dawson show, and the next thing you're in Carlisle.
Yeah.
Where we stayed for a long time because somebody had organised some coaches, and a lot of the people on the passengers on the Pan Am jet were most stewardesses, the odd steward, and they'd been sent up to provide sort of comfort and assistance to any surviving passengers, and of course we didn't know at that time that there were none.
Yeah.
So we sat on the bus for ages while somebody decided what they would do with us.
Right. So see, I have this kind of image of, average person in Lockerbie, fairly unremarkable place at the time. And you're sitting watching the Les Dawson show, and the next thing all hell breaks loose, and it's raining shrapnel, and there's bodies crashing down, and fireball at the end of the street. Because you open the door, it's not going to go away. You can't rub your eyes and it's gone. You kind of blink and pinch yourself and wake up. They were stuck with it until help came, and I would imagine the local Bobby came with his torch and went above my pay grade. So when were you parachuted in? Did you go straight there, or did you have to wait till the morning? Or
some of us were taken to a hotel and where we shared rooms, and then there was an advance guard went up to Lockerbie and liaised with the police and got straight onto it. So I remember I shared a room in the hotel with a colleague, Rob Carter. Not that we got much sleep, and we got up and it was still dark because it was coming up to Christmas, and there were a few images appearing on the TV screens. We could hear. I remember listening on the radio to one of our colleagues in an SARC King helicopter who was up there, and he was subsequently interviewed by Valerie Singleton, which I remember being very envious about that. My goodness, he's probably going to get a Blue Peter badge, and it's something I always wanted as a child.
I know someone who's got one of them.
Oh, yes.
The real one, yeah, Blue Peter badge.
Well, one thing, Bill, that I'd like to mention is the AAIB are the forgotten first responders. Nobody ever hardly mentions us. The police in the recent one referred to us as our consultants to our, which we're not. In fact, they would be more like consultants to ours.
Yeah.
And they needed our expertise because they had totally unrealistic expectations about how they could handle it. I mean, they wanted to. They wanted every piece of evidence, every piece, bear in mind must be about 500,000 or so pieces, photographed in situ with a label attached and two policemen standing over it.
Yeah,
and photographed, and there just there's not that many labels.
Still be there, and it still be there now.
Yeah.
Well, for example, if a substantial piece of structure came landed on the ground, it would probably break up into others, and flakes of paint would come off, and you would get a scattering of debris. Several times the number of the items on this table. So do you have one label for all of it, which seems a sensible way to go, or do you have a separate tag for every little item or flake of paint? But that's initially what they seemed to want to do, but pragmatism eventually won the day, I think, didn't it?
What they agreed on in the end was to let us decide anything that looks at all suspicious, and then we call what they called a production team, which means that they would then do that, but only on the bits that we identified as interesting.
Right.
This is to ensure continuity of evidence, without which anybody that could subsequently be accused could easily get off.
So they took you to the place, and Steve's described this to me in the past. Some of the carnage. It all seems to get, don't look at the bad bits. It all seems to get glossed over a bit. The fact that there was bodies all over the place, and I mean, I don't know, where did all the soil and the rubble and the bricks go from when the wing smashed that big hole? Was that just flung over the town? So I mean, you get out of the car. What did you think? What was your first thought when you?
Well, my impression was just how enormous the site was, because we got a ride in a taxi from Carlisle up to Lockerbie, and I remember getting the whiff of kerosene, and then burnt kerosene, and then the smell of wreckage, burnt wreckage, which once you smell is with you forever.
I can imagine.
And there was sort of a few stones started appearing on the road, and the taxi was steering around those. Then the amount of rubble got more and more. And eventually we were in the middle of town, and we just went to the academy where we were told that where we were going to assemble along with the police. And at one point there were over 600 police in the town, which is the entire establishment of the Dumfries and Galloway constabulary. So they were subsequently reinforced by the Strathclyde police, who seemed to be very hard men in comparison. So we from there we eventually, and it did take until the middle of the morning, we got allocated sites. So Steve got Tundergarth, where the front fuselage was, the nose of the aircraft, and I got the big hole in the ground, which subsequently was discovered been made by the wing, which dived in bereft of the fuselage. In fact, there was the wing on its own, almost tip to tip, just the trip fairings are missing. Because
people tend to think a wing, you've got one on that side and you glue that into your airfix, and you've got one on that side and you glue that into your airfix. This was the whole thing.
The wing is one structural entity, and it's from almost tip to tip. It's just the sort of the composite bits on the tip that weren't there. And there were even a few bits of fuselage were identified, and I think a couple of seat rows might have been in there as well. But it was just an enormous hole in the ground, and the debris was thrown over the immediate area, because people who came to the site during the day had to pick themselves through all this muck, and it was not that easy.
No, I can imagine.
In sort of office type shoes, which most of them seem to have.
The police were initially very ill equipped. They had their shiny shoes, not boots, and they had to go out and buy wellies in bulk.
I remember you telling me a story, because it's like everything else. Whenever there's dark things going on, there's always something funny happens in the middle of it. And there was a couple of really good books I read years ago, not long after the Falklands War, and they're called Don't Cry for Me, Sergeant Major, and Try Not to Laugh, Sergeant Major. And it was the funny side of the Falklands War. And one story that stuck in my mind was about a British officer who was obeying the call of nature. So there he is out the way a bit, squatting over a hole in the ground, and 20 Argentinian soldiers appeared to offer surrender. And it said he didn't know whether to finish what he was doing or accept the surrender, and in the end he got in a terrible state trying to do both at once. so he accepted the surrender and immediately requisitioned a pair of trousers. And it's a great little story. And I remember you telling me something about ill-equipped policemen trying to get out of the back of a Chinook, and that all going terribly wrong. What was that one?
After about 5 days or so, we were picking the cockpit section clean of any possible evidence. It didn't have a lot, to be honest. And so they said, look, we've got a report of a wing way out in the Bundu, but we don't think we're missing any wing. Could you go and take a look? So a Chinook duly pitched up with me. It was full of policemen and RAF personnel carrying body bags, big folded up plastic, and I got on with them because it was going in that area, and it landed pretty close to where this so-called wing, which turned out to be an elevator. People don't realise how big the 747 is, and it did its party trick because the ground was soft and uneven. It balanced on its rear wheels and applying power to keep the nose off the air and in the ground, and so it was generating a huge amount of downwash, and it was on a slope, so as soon as they got off the ramp they were running downhill, and to add ridiculousness to it, the loadmaster, the RAF loadmaster, was he was used to unloading troops.
Right.
So his brief is go, 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 go. So that was sort of startling them, and they were rushing off. And every one of them, I think, fell over and rolled down the hill. And except me, I just got up and strolled down. Not me, mate. Yes.
Not having any of that.
But all of us have sort of had sort of odd stories to tell. I mean, within Site B, we're getting very worried about what we might find, because some of the firemen were getting hypodermic needles through their boots, because that was one of the sort of items being carried in the cargo.
Right.
And we uncovered a bit of wreckage in the garden, and we found what would look like a dismembered leg. With a big woolen stocking over it, and everybody stopped work and we called somebody medically qualified. I think it was a doctor who came over, and he started unravelling the top of this sock, and a few of us sort of recoiled, and it was all obviously very squidgy, and this sort of dark substance started oozing out, and he just put his finger in and licked it, and the rest of us sort of held our breaths. And he says it's Dundee Marmalade. And it was a sock had been packed with several jars of marmalade to try and, protect them against the excesses of the baggage handlers, I guess. Yeah. And that's what we were looking at. There was a huge sigh of relief. Yeah. I mean, why should you sigh with relief when, hundreds of people around you had died? But those are the sort of, we hung on to those little bits of relief, which sort of to get on with the next bit.
Yeah, I remember the lad who went off in the Chinook. He said they landed a few times to have a look at stuff, and he said one place he got out and he said there was completely intact bottles of spirits, come all the way down and just stuck in the grass.
Yes. And I remember that those you come back a few days later and that bottle of whiskey would still be sat in the ground. Yeah, and then one day it wasn't.
Well, it was gone.
Yes. So we never knew who had it away. I always suspected Steve.
Steve's had it.
No, it wasn't. No,
wasn't Steve.
Bad karma.
It'll be one of them Scottish policemen that not have been able to put up with that sticking out of the grass, put it in a good home, just end up as evidence.
Well, we were accompanied often by a guy called Mike Stresky, who's a policeman, plain clothes, I think, but he was a good guy and he liked aeroplanes and understood. And we were out with a Aerospatiale, very popular helicopter.
Oh, the Squirrel.
Squirrel, yeah. PLN Helicopters, who he was one of the directors, I think. And we were just looking up and seeing if there was anything there that we'd missed. And sure enough, in a little crevasse about sort of 4 feet wide or something like that, there was a sort of brightly coloured suitcase. And we said, well, it's not really our remit, but I think we'd better pick it up because they won't see that from the ground. Yeah. And John Poland brought the helicopter in, and he parked it across with the front of the skids on one side and the rear skids, and they opened the door, and Mike leaned out to try and get it under his seatbelt so he could go a bit further and fell out into the ditch.
Oops.
Yeah. But, yes, it was full of sort of iconic little moments.
By the time you got there, you knew that there was a 747 had broken up and hit the ground, and it's a big old bus. And you knew that it was flying 1 minute, and then it wasn't. And there was no mayday call, and it was all in pieces in the air. And there's not that many scenarios where that would happen. such a big aircraft. So being, professionals and investigators, was it, speculation around the coffee machine? We think it might be this.
Not really.
I think we've always been good at sort of keeping open minds. Now, I think most of us had heard of the, I still remember it, the Section 41 cracking. Section 41 referred to the forward fuselage, which was, it referred to the place where it was built, I think, Section 41. And as the aircraft goes up and down, the fuselage skin sort of undergoes this oil canning process. It pants in and out, and some minor cracks had been discovered, but it was all being contained. But as the nose had fallen off, I remember wondering at the time, well, this is probably a process that we're going to have to go through, investigating the history of this forward fuselage cracks. But the first job was to really find out what we got and where. So it was a big sort of plotting exercise. And as the days went by, and we came across, well, primarily for me, it was bits of luggage that appeared to be sort of stained with or blackened with smoke or flame. And if something had just broken up as a result of a structural failure, then where would the smoke and the flame come from? So that's when we started to think about maybe a bomb, and we did make sure that was was subject to those rigorous police production rules and properly tagged and taken care of.
Because there's something you said to me the last time which I didn't realise, was that you see the dramatisations and the whatever recreations, and there's always this thing trailing fire in its wake with bits coming off that comes. It wasn't actually on fire in the air, was it?
No. You can tell them you're blue in the face. Yeah. But aeroplanes only crash because they're on fire. I mean, as far as it can.
And the crew always do this.
Yeah.
I've noticed that. Yeah, but it's one of those things you kind of expect it to be on fire, so that's how it's always portrayed. Yeah. But I was glancing at the report, and it said that the engines had a bit of fire around them as they fell, but the actual, I don't know if I read that correctly, but the actual, to reiterate, the big bit or the big bits were never on fire.
No. Right. Well, the engines, of course, have got the flame burning within them, and that immediately gets snuffed out. But as the engines separate or become starved of fuel, the flame will die, and there will be a bit of smoke as it burns in an over-rich way for a few seconds.
Right. Well, the fire that famously was photographed, that was the wing full of jet fuel. Slamming into the ground at very high speed.
It's what they call dieseling. In other words, it was compression because it hit the ground at a great speed. And so it diesel exploded like a diesel.
As it deforms, it's compression ignition of the fuel vapour within the structure. We used to investigate military accidents and fast jets, tornadoes and Jaguars. Or Harriers, and if they flew into the ground at high speed, that's exactly what they would do. You'd always get a mushroom cloud, a big sort of rosy flame.
Does it atomise the fuel as well, wouldn't that amount of fuel?
Well, in fact, it probably doesn't. It's sort of it's over-rich. You probably remember seeing some experiments on anti-mist kerosene, where they make it into one big lump. There's a picture of a jet. It's a Boeing 720, I believe, and they deliberately crash it onto a field of stakes to make the wing break up. And it looks like it's a faded, great rosy explosion, but in fact it was a qualified success because it didn't mist, and those flames that you saw were very rich and didn't last long, so it's possible that some people, had there been real people in that plane, could have survived.
That footage is in a music video somewhere. I think it's a Queen video. I'm going to have to find that now. I know exactly what you mean, because you see it pile in, there's a hydraulic hose or something in all of this. Yeah, I know exactly. I'm going to have to find
it. It's in the film Airplane as well.
Is it? Yes.
The passengers are all watching it on the screen.
That's the in-flight movie.
Oh, no. I'll have to find that. So you got the cockpit. There's a few pictures. I've seen the picture of you up a ladder in your red kit, and there's a few other pictures of you stood around the place in your red kit. I mean, you always see it. There's only seems to be two shots. One from the front, which I mean, I guess that's the money shot. It's like the bow of Titanic. That's the one that says here is an aeroplane. And there's a few shots from above which show a bit of scattered wreckage, but it's always kind of looking that way. Was it just in the middle of nowhere? Was there anything around it?
It was. We kept the press at bay because it was. We were like excavating the rear of it, which was, all sort of collapsed and baggage bins hanging down and wiring, and it was pretty horrific. There were quite a few victims in there, and we didn't want the press getting pictures of those. Yeah, on my cockpit site, I only produced one production for the police. I came across it was like a big bar of butter, square, the rectangular, about slightly smaller than the brick.
Yeah.
But and it was soft, and it was wrapped in duct tape, and I just peeled it a bit to have a look at it, and it was like grey plasticine. I thought, hello. And so I got the police to produce it, and we took it to Lockerbie, and there was this chap whose name we can't remember, from Radi, he said, I don't know what this is. He said, anybody got a match? And he just gave him a match, no, lighter, and he lit it, and it just sort of fizzled. No, he said, it's not explosive, it's in fact, what it turned out to be, it was like caulking.
All right.
For sealing gaps in floor panels and things like that.
Yeah.
It was Dr. Faraday.
Yeah.
Dr. Faraday, not of the Faraday cage, though.
No.
Yeah.
In fact, Margaret Thatcher's minders asked me if I could stop her going around the back because she'll get upset. So,
I remember you'd mentioned something about Margaret Thatcher not being allowed in certain places. That must be what it was. Yeah, there was another thing about Margaret Thatcher, and I might have dreamt this. Is it true she turned up a bit worse for the gin?
Whiskey was her tipple.
Right.
And she talked to me, or she asked me a question, and I answered it to the best of my ability. But it was like she still had a transmit button pressed. I don't think she was really taking in what I was saying.
Right.
Which didn't matter because it was all a bit garbled. I mean, I didn't know at that time what made this big hole in the ground, because I was on duty by this big hole at Sherwood Crescent. Mm-hmm. And all day, or all morning anyway, there was a procession of high-priced or dignitaries. Procession of people who were coming along. There was the American ambassador, whose name was Charles Price, and there was Malcolm Rifkind. I didn't speak to him. Margaret Thatcher, and the Duke of York came by as well.
Didn't you chuck him out of the hole in the ground?
Well, I tried to, because as Steve will confirm, we get a bit territorial about our wreckage sites. We don't want anybody to intervene. Now, this was a huge hole, and I was walking around the perimeter of it with a policeman. We all each had a policeman minder, and I saw two people at the bottom of the hole, and I thought, we have to get them out. They might be corrupting evidence. One of them was obviously a policeman, but he had so much scrambled egg on his peak of his hat that I have no idea what rank he was. And the other guy looked a bit familiar, and he had some sort of uniform on as well. So I asked who they were, and the policeman said, "Well, I'm Sir somebody or other, Deputy Chief Constable of Dumfries and Galloway, and this is the Duke of York." So I had to go into sort of forelock tugging mode at that point. But so I backpedaled a bit, and the Duke of York actually, he asked, he was there in his naval uniform because he was at the time a helicopter pilot. Yeah. He flew Lynxes with the Royal Navy. And so we had a bit of a conversation, an aviation-based conversation, and he asked all the right questions, and I didn't have many of the answers, but he was sympathetic, and he obviously was finding it difficult to take in the horror of the situation. So it was anyway. They eventually sort of went on their way after climbing in an undignified manner out of the hole, because it was quite difficult to get in and out.
Well, I have seen a picture, I'm not sure if it was your picture, and I'd love to show it to people if it's available anywhere, of looking up out of the hole, because all the pictures are shot from the top. Yeah, it's a big hole, but looking out of it from beneath, just ridiculous. I mean, if you had to dig that hole with earth-moving machinery, you'd be on for a week.
Oh yes, it was
massive. It was massive.
I think somebody calculated it was about 650 cubic metres, which I thought it was.
They wanted to
a bit small.
Estimate the, if you like, the explosive impact of an impact like that, in case of course, nuclear power stations.
Oh, right.
You know, they wanted to know whether, you know, if something of that magnitude could breach. I don't know what the final result was.
I'll find it in the report.
No, I'm not sure it's in.
There was a figure for the amount of earth that was moved.
Yeah.
And there was a Richter scale reading 1.6 on the Richter scale or something and it was all cross-referenced to give the exact times. I did, as I say, I skimmed the report. I'll do it properly.
Yeah, we often used to get the Richter scale reading for pinpointing an accident time, because throughout those years there was quite a regular occurrence to have a Jaguar or tornado thudding in somewhere in the north of England or Scotland, and it would register on a seismometer somewhere.
Yeah, this was a thing. And again, it's one of these things that, you know, you get the dramatisation and it's all very terrible. But right, I did a few body recoveries in my diving career, people in water, and now and again I dealt with the relatives. And it was always they wanted to extend basic comforts to the people in lost. You know, you need to get him out the river, it's going to be cold. You know, you need to get her out the lock because it'll be dark and she's scared of the dark. And it was, you know, everybody knew it wasn't going to make the slightest bit of difference, but everybody wanted that. And if it was one of my loved ones had come down in an air accident, I'd want them brought out of there with some kind of dignity. And I think you said there were the rear fuselage you'd come down through a house with about 50 people in it, and I mean, there's no drop-down menu for a plane in a house. So who gets the job of getting the victims out, and how did they do it?
This was Site B, Rosebank, a section of the rear fuselage just after the wing come down, and I think there were 50 people in there. So I spent a lot of my time there, and it was grim because the wreckage had spilled across a number of rear gardens in Rosebank Terrace, and the RAF were there with a small crane. They called it an iron fairy.
Right.
And so the guys were sort of cutting up the wreckage, and then they would sort of lift a piece off. And of course, the work was always being interrupted when they exposed one or more of the passengers, and they had to be manhandled out with as much dignity as they could muster. And the RAF had an absolutely terrible job. Yeah. And I think some of them
young, weren't they?
That suffered with, I imagine, what was PTSD, but it was nobody used that term in those days.
Really, was it?
And they used to tackle it with lots of beer in the evenings, but it was a very grim few days. And of course, people, apart from the end house which took the brunt of the impact, people were living still in all the others, even though their back gardens were knee deep in debris. And on one day the people sort of invited us in for tea and cake, and it was amazing to see them. You just close the door to the back garden, and there were the family still trying to enjoy what remained of Christmas. The atmosphere was basically happy and warm and enveloping, and it was that was one of the standout days for me. We were invited in by that family. I mean, I can't even remember which number the house was now, but I should have gone back to thank them. But it was tea, coffee, cake.
Yeah, it's good how people do that in crisis, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was absolutely throwing down with rain. So you're walking around, and once the debris was starting to be cleared, your feet just weighed, kilograms, because they were just gathering clay all the time.
Yeah, the other people I don't think really get quite enough credit is the WRVS and the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army were out with their wagon, tea wagon and bun wagon, and the WRVS sort of manned the catering back at dinner and what have you back at the Lockerbie Academy, and did it all over Christmas. Gave up their Christmas for that. I really was very impressed.
Well, one of the many American visitors we had said, "How come your voluntary organisations are so much better than our professional ones?" Which really, but the Salvation Army were great, and I remember actually hiding from them because we'd had one visit and were force-fed mince pies and tea and coffee and Mars bars, and we carried on, and oh God, there's another van we could see, so we hid in the ditch that had gone by because we didn't want to hurt their feelings by saying no, because they scour the countryside looking for us.
Looking for people to feed. Yeah. These are the little things that you never get to hear about. It's important, I think. It's very much more the human side of it.
Yeah. Well, there was a funny little adjunct to that, because Andy and me and the first wave, as I call it, were sent back in the new year to sort of have the Christmas that we missed. And then, of course, Kegworth, the 737 British Midland happened.
Before our next programme, we're going over to the newsroom for a news flash from Michael Burke.
An airliner with 118 passengers on board has crashed on the M1 motorway in Leicestershire. It came down near Kegworth.
Yeah, and it wasn't the same as Lockerbie. I mean, it was a single site, really. I was just off the M1 motorway. Yeah. But the Lockerbie Salvation Army, they used to have cream cakes because the supermarkets were giving them, near sell-by date, and they were bringing them round. And at Kegworth, I went to the Salvation Army wagon, and I said, yes. I said, "Have you got coffee?" "Yes, we've got coffee." I said, "Have you got any cream cakes?" And they said, "No." I said, "Well, at Lockerbie, they had cream cakes." Did they? The next day, I went up and I said, "Just a coffee, please, that's all I fancy." And they went, "You are having a cream cake." And so did everybody else. Everybody else was wandering off with a cream cake,
Wondering why they got a cream cake. Yeah. So, you mentioned the fuselage that had spilled out into the houses and all that to be cut up by the RAF. Was that the same with the cockpit? Was that cut into pieces and burrowed into...
Yeah. The problem with the cockpit is it's probably, apart from the shattered landing gear centre section of the wing, it's probably the heaviest part of the structure. So it was very heavy, and it was too heavy, I think, even for a Chinook to lift. So it had to be cut. I think it was eventually cut into 9 pieces, and carted off to all this stuff. Ended up at Central Ammunition Depot at Longtown.
Yes.
Where there happened to be about, God knows how many acres.
It was 29 acres, I remember that. I remember being told
inside
that when it was tested.
Yeah.
There were structural
members. It wasn't tall enough to actually lay out 3D, so it was laid out as 2D. And it was that's where we started to I started to piece together all of what I called the interesting bits, and made a sort of yellow grid showing the stringers and the frames and everything, and laying these bits on it. And that's where we received a visit from Lord, who was the chairman of British Airways?
It was Lord King at the time, was it?
King, yeah.
Lord King.
And the US ambassador, Charles Price. I remember him. He was a real gentleman. And they came round in this little knot. I'm not sure what Lord King was doing in there, but the ambassador looked at me and said, "Do you know, Mr. Moss, I don't understand how a big airplane like a 747 can end up in so many small pieces." And the major in charge of Longtown was escorting them around. He said, "I can answer that, I think, sir. This is with a practical demonstration." He said, if you go along in a car, wind down the window and hold out a banana unpeeled and into the thing, it won't unravel. But if you just start it going, just peel it back a little bit, the whole thing can sort of just unzip. And he said, that's somebody explained that to me, and I thought that was very practical. And Charles Price sort of looked at, yes, well, thank you very much, Major, Mr. Mott. Now, why did they?
You just know, don't you?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to get in the car with Emily now.
Yes, and just have a go with the banana.
Yeah, and we're going to be winging down the M6 or the A1 with a banana out the window, and there'll be people behind getting hit with bits of banana.
Yes.
Yeah, we're going to do that experiment, see how well that works.
Yeah.
Right, you ready? Right, see if a banana will peel just on its own. Not a chance, that's not going to peel, is it? Not a hope. Did it work? I think we can safely declare that experiment a success.
Because I was reading about the breakup of the aircraft, and it got a hole popped in the side, and it basically came apart in about 3 seconds. Or the cockpit came off in something like 3 seconds.
The cockpit came off in about 4 seconds.
4 seconds.
Was the official.
Yeah.
It peeled off to the right.
Mm-hmm.
So it bent off to the right.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, where that picture of me up the ladder is, I'm looking at a scuff mark on the side of the fuselage on the right side that I couldn't really account for. And then I suddenly realised it was sort of semicircular.
Yeah.
And I realised it was the imprint of an engine intake.
Hit the number 3 engine.
Hit the number 3 and knocked it off.
Or even the number 4.
No, it's 3, I think.
I think I've always assumed it was number 4, but
we'll
whatever. We'll have to read the report again.
You'll have to read your own report. Yeah. Well, I read the report last night, and my understanding of it is, and I'm not the expert, I just read the report, was that it was number 3.
Okay.
Because number 3 landed somewhere different.
Yeah.
1, 2, and 4 landed in the town, and 3 was somewhere. That's what it said, and it said it did that because it got hit by the cockpit as it went by.
That was our colleague Rob.
Well, this was
Carlton.
late at night, so I may have got that wrong.
Well, one ended up in an abattoir, in the yard of an abattoir. I remember that.
One squashed a water main as well, didn't it?
That reversed its way into the street, and it missed the water and the telecom, but it got a direct hit on the sewer.
Oh, is that what it was? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
So you can't flush the toilet as well as you
got worse and worse.
Absolutely.
You could still make a phone call though.
Oh, that's all right. You could ring for a portaloo. Yeah.
And one sad little episode. We try. I think Andy's the same. We try and not get involved with the victims' stories if we can.
Yeah.
And in fact, what happened is the Chinook that had taken me out to look at this elevator had dropped me back up at my site. No, he had taken me, said, do you want to go into Lockerbie? So I said, yeah, I've pretty much finished anyway, out on the site. And they landed in a playing field. And I got out. I thought, well, I'll just walk to the academy from here. And I stopped at the town hall where they had all the floral tributes. And there was a note. It was read something like, to the pretty little girl in the red dress who made a boring flight so much more enjoyable. You didn't deserve this. And I was,
oof. Yeah. There was one of our associates at the time, one of our drinking buddies. He was a loadmaster, I think, on Chinooks.
Yeah.
And he got a call. He was in the mess having a drink when this happened. And he said he picked his drink up and he got to there, and the boss burst in the door and said, anybody not had a drink out here now? And he said he stood for a bit thinking, have I had a drink? And I'm about it, or have I not? And he said eventually, curiosity got him. And he went outside and the boss said, look, there's a plane down, we've got to go. So they jumped in the Chinook, and he said they could see the fire from a long way off. And they spent the evening, this is recollection, and it's what he told me, it's not in a report anyway. But he said they flew around all night looking at stuff and looking for survivors. But he said the one thing that got him was the body of a child had hit some soil beside a wall where nothing was growing. It was like it's very fine clay soil. And he said this infant had hit the soil and bounced over the wall, and he said he could see the fingerprints and that very, very, eyelashes, and he said that really, really cut him up, and I can well believe it.
Yeah.
But they had young crew on the Chinook who were badly shaken, much as you described.
Yeah.
RAF people.
Because they have a core of sort of few NCOs who are specialists in salvage, but for something like this, they would just call airmen straight off to squadrons.
Yeah.
So get up there and start picking up bodies. There's
a really interesting article somewhere, it might be worth looking up on the internet, about the Mount Erebus crash where they flew a DC-10 into the mountain, and two of the people who went up there to recover the bodies, they were just policemen from New Zealand. And they said, you better go up there, and they'd never seen the likes in their lives, and they were up there for about a fortnight recovering bodies. And some of them an engine had gone down a crevasse and melted the ice, and it had frozen around some bodies and had to chip them out. And by the time they got back, they were covered in soot and jet fuel and fat and all sorts of nasties. But read their story, they were just plucked off the streets of New Zealand where they're chasing shoplifters around, and next thing they're on Antarctica digging bodies out of the snow. And it really, really got to them. They had no training or anything like that.
It's probably worth mentioning on the subject of bodies, nobody gets sort of trained how to deal with bodies. I mean, I knew when I joined the branch, and so did Steve, that you go to scenes where people had died, and although in many cases the police and ambulance people get there first, and if they can remove the bodies, they do. If they're still sort of entangled with the wreckage, then they sort of phone us up, and we will generally say we'll leave them there until we get there, so we can, cut cables, or the cables can be cut under our supervision. But it was still, it's always a shock, I think, to every new person to have to deal with this. And I remember as a child when there was a local aircraft, I think it was a Vulcan that crashed nearby, and 7 people were killed, and there was a picture of a sea of confetti, which is what was left of the Vulcan. And I remember looking for sort of 7 little or 7 lumps which were the human beings. It never even occurred to me that people could break up like aircraft do when they hit the ground. Yeah. And so when you would come across sort of fragments of people, that was really sort of very, very distressing. Yeah. But I think, I certainly I developed a sort of tunnel vision where I could look at the bits I needed to and force the rest of it to the back of my mind, and it was difficult to do for a start.
Well, the first body recovery I got involved in was a diver who'd been lost for a while, and it was all a big adventure. We're going to see if we can find him and get him back, and it was all a big adventure till we did. Oh, hang on a minute, we've got a real casualty here, and we lifted him to the surface. And police came and they put him on a body bag, and the doctor had to come and declare him dead, although it was very, very obvious. But he had a dive computer on his wrist, and they wanted to get it to try and download it, and they took his glove off. And all that was left, and they took the glove off, he'd been in the water a long time, was just, you see these Halloween hands, and just it was just, and I remember being horrified. And that was my first, after that I wasn't bothered. But the first thing, whoa, you can't do that. It was the most horrible, shiny, white, glistening bones of that. Oh, it's horrible. But I got used to it after that.
I had a bad reaction to my first. The branch, what they like to do is to send new boys out with a couple of experienced inspectors, operations and engineering. And my turn came. And it was dark. It was a thing called a MAL, ML5. It's a sort of very sole takeoff and landing aircraft.
High wing tail dragger.
About four seats, and it had crashed. It was doing sort of very stupid things like tight turns, and it departed. and span in and burst into flames, and they were pretty quick, so it didn't completely. But when I got there, and this was the first time I think I'd ever seen a dead body, there was just this white hand sticking out this pile of wreckage, and I went, ooh, I didn't like that.
I remember you telling me about that, and one thing I took on board was the arc lamps, and so I went to a site once where it was getting dark, and there were arc lamps, and it lights things up in a sort of slightly purple brilliance, and it really does amplify the ghoulish aspects of the scenes. And I do recall that on one of the Lockerbie sites, they said to me as it got dark at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, would you like us to bring some arc lamps? And I distinctly remember saying, oh no thanks, we have to go back for our meeting, which was an excuse, but I didn't want what was already a very horrific scene at Rosebank being illuminated by arc lamps. Thank you very much.
I had a very similar experience. I was asked to, it started out as a body recovery, started out as a rescue and ended up as a body recovery, and it was a multiple drowning. One guy had gone in the water and got into trouble. His mate had gone in, and they'd all gone in after one another, and I think there was 4 of them drowned before people started to get back out of the water. And the police had just got a new sonar system, which I was really familiar with, and they weren't. They just got it, didn't know how it worked, and 100 million buttons and menus. So they rang me and said, can you quick, we need to get onto this. So I finished up on the police boat, working the sonar for them, just me undercover kind of thing. They went, right, there's one here, there's one there. And they were only in about 10 feet of water, but the police divers went in and got them one by one. And they put them on the shore, and by now they've roped a bit off, and there's all these spectators dock, and all these people had come for a look, and they laid out the body bags, and every time they got one of these lads, they put them on the and then the mountain rescue brought the arc lamps. And it was just like, it had gone from, it was quiet and dark and a bit of moonlight and it was all going well. There's illuminated horror story on the beach.
Yes.
Because all the spectators now can see all this
like moths to a light.
Yeah,
literally.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, and it's one of those things you can talk about it all day long, but unless you've been there. But I have been there.
Well, one of the things I learned at Lockerbie that I didn't know before, I expect you know, is that sniffer dogs can smell underwater.
Yes. Yeah, I know someone that trains them.
Yeah. They the oils right from the surface.
Yeah.
And the trouble is that this Andy will remember this. Raynet, who are sort of a bunch of amateur radio enthusiasts, they delight in setting up a sort of network to get coverage, long. They ended up really just doing carrying our mobile phones, our so-called mobile phones, and the trouble is that it was all relayed, and it was all, the press were listening in because it was all open, open source. So it was there, And I heard one message. Could what was his name? Dr. from Radi? Yeah, I can't remember his name. Dr. So-and-so, bomb expert. Please come to the academy now. On
the other hand, I did find them very useful one day. I was sort of, after I'd got away from Site B, I was given a sort of country beat to grid off and look for items of wreckage. So I went around with people from the RAF, the smash and crash teams, and we had a Raynet guy allocated, which I didn't particularly want because I had my mobile phone brick, which was cutting my shoulder on its strap. And of course, out on the open countryside, there was no signal. But the guy with the radio, on one occasion when we came across a bit of luggage that looked deeply suspicious to my eyes, we got him to give a sort of guarded signal to come up to, I think we probably used an OS grid reference, and in order to get a police production team up there, and they duly arrived, and I couldn't raise these people on my mobile phone, and so they were useful.
On the radio. So at what point, and I imagine that it was you chaps that got to this first, at what point were you kind of saying, I think this is a bomb?
Well, for me, I was suspicious when I saw my first bit of burnt luggage. Other people had found some as well. The fact that the guys from the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment at Fort Halstead had come along, that indicated the way the people were thinking. And of course all these bits have to be swabbed for traces of explosive. I think they still use the 1889 Explosive Substances Act or something like that in order to get convictions. And Semtex, because I think that's what it was, doesn't leave much in the way of traces. So we knew that there had to be the bits of wreckage had to be handled very carefully and preserved as much as possible. Mm-hmm. So those bits were sent off, and I think the fact that they were sent off to Fort Halstead was sort of an indication of the people that just needed confirmation. And when the results came back, that was when Inspector in Charge, Mick Charles, he made an announcement, and I remember he had his face sort of taking half the page of the I think it was the Daily Telegraph, with the literally a bombshell announcement.
It has been established that 2 parts of the metal luggage pallets framework show conclusive evidence of a detonating high explosive.
Yeah, but I presume it was the investigators yourselves that first started. This is bad. It wasn't the police or the Americans or anybody else who come along. It was
the Americans try and make out that they made the first, got the first evidence. It wasn't. No. I think it was various Aaib, because Aaib were put in charge, because we're such a small, relatively organisation, we were put in charge of larger teams of like police and specialists from Boeing and Pan Am and things like that. And so there was, quite a few people, and they were starting almost simultaneously to pick up. There's a picture in the report of a very, I call it cornflakey, crinkly, it's actually a doubler. It's where you've got a lap joint like that, and it's all crinkly all around the edges, and that's blast damage. There was no doubt. Yeah. And they say, oh well, you've got to get the chemical swabs. Well, yeah, we knew it. Yeah. That's where we really, Mick Charles, the investigator in charge.
You've got to be careful though, because although it definitely looked like it was, it required a huge amount of energy, such as would occur in a blast, to create this fragment. It was outside the experience of that. We could surmise and be, in that case, be readily accurate, but we weren't qualified to actually say that at the time, even though that's what it appeared. So all the work is then spent on gathering, substantiating evidence, which, in case one of our colleagues was sort of piecing together the luggage container within the lower fuselage where the bomb was, because all the other containers were sort of squashed up, but there was this one that was fragmented as the bomb just burst out and blew the surrounding luggage to pieces. And that's what led on to the pieces of this Toshiba cassette recorder.
Oh, a little piece of circuit board that caused all the fuss.
Which then it could be traced what type of Toshiba recorder it was.
Toshiba bomb beat, I believe.
Probably. And then it was some of the bits inside would be hollowed out to make room for the explosive and the detonator. And the detonator, I think, was a known quantity. So that didn't leave very much space for the explosive material, which was about a pound, I believe, and or 450 odd grams. And it was always a mystery as to how such a small amount of explosive could do for a huge aeroplane like the 747, which is where a lot of the subsequent investigation effort was spent.
Yeah, that report is many deep. It goes into a lot of detail. Does that?
Yeah.
So did it? I mean, I know. Well, I know. I don't. I wasn't there. But watching the reconstruction dramatizations, it seems like the more complicated it got with, this is a bomb, then the Americans start arriving, and the CIA start arriving, and the FBI, and all of these people. Did it ever feel like a kind of slick operation, or was it all just
not really
blunder from day to day?
Really, once it was shown to be a bomb.
Yeah. So by this point, I'm assuming you'd more or less finished with what you were doing at Longtown and got all your interest.
Oh yeah, well,
and that all went to the branch.
Well, not the whole thing.
No, just
what happened. Yeah,
the bit.
Was Chris decided that he just wanted 25 feet either side of the bomb blast.
Yeah.
So that didn't include the cockpit.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't include anything after the wing.
Mm-hmm.
And so only that was given a 3D reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
The rest is, in fact, I think it's still there, isn't it? In a scrapyard somewhere in Lincolnshire?
It is. I did a bit of research on that, and it is still in the scrapyard. And I actually phoned the chap and said, would it be possible for me to just go and stand in front of it and shoot a little piece to camera? And he said, I'm not allowed to take anybody down there, but he does still have it. So it does still exist. And you did let me have a look at the reconstruction in the hangar at the branch, and that was
plenty of pictures of that.
That was a creepy thing. Yeah, that was a creepy thing. What I remember about that was because it was tall, and therefore the lid, the top of the lounge was next door to it. The open top was in among the lights. The lights were inside, and because all the window belt down that side was all buckled and bent, I remember walking along and seeing the lights flickering inside, and for all the world there was people up there. Whoa, that was creepy. That was creepy.
The thing is that for quite a few years, the police would not allow us to take photographs of our own work.
Right.
They insisted. They said if you want photographs of it for your report or whatever, you'll have to let us take them.
Yeah.
And just being bureaucratic, I think that.
I don't know. So just to kind of wrap up, if you like. I mean, I know you've both done a lot of investigations. I'm not sure which ones you've done. I know you did the Colin McRae one and various others. You did the Manchester Air Tours one, and there was Kegworth. You know, on your list of investigations that you've done, you know, in terms of difficulty, in terms of, you know, memorable things, and is Lockerbie right at the top, or is there other ones that kind of?
For me, no. I mean, for me, because I've always wanted to know how things work and how they might go wrong, I think the most memorable investigation for me, and Steve will remember it because he's a World War II aircraft nut, is an accident to at the time only airworthy de Havilland Mosquito. And I did my apprenticeship in the hangar where the Mosquito was assembled, so I've always been particularly fond of the Mozzie. And this thing had crashed at Barton Moss near Manchester in 1990 something. And thank you, had a civilian registration following an engine failure, and getting into the why the engine failed, which fundamentally was a problem with the carburettor, which had been modified wrongly and then subsequently misassembled so that it didn't function under reduced G. That caused a failure and a problem with the handling of the aircraft, and I did a couple of successive stalls and crashed into a wood at the end of Barton runway. That was fascinating because I came across people who had been instrumental in the design of the Rolls-Royce Merlin and who had worked on a development of the Merlin in the Second World War. So this is in the mid-1990s. And of course, those people are long since gone now. But that was a sort of a very sort of positive link to the past, which enabled us to get to the bottom of why that aircraft crashed. The report is still on the AAIB website, but for some reason they didn't bother to include the diagrams and drawings. And I remember sort of working out how to use one of the Illustrator programs, and I was very proud of the drawings, but they haven't survived. They haven't been digitised, unfortunately.
We might have to do that one another time. Do that one again.
Well, I mean, another one that Andy and I worked on together, which it was fairly interesting, wasn't it? It was Stansted, the Korean air freighter. Yeah. That had a lot going for it.
The 747.
Had a lot going for it.
Well, it had a lot of it. Well, it had a lot.
We now cross to the BBC newsroom for a news report from Peter Sissons.
There's been an air crash tonight at Stansted Airport near London. A Boeing 747 cargo plane, believed to be Korean, has come down in fields shortly after takeoff close to the airport.
Well, see, what was not conveyed to me, certainly, is I didn't know that it was only a freighter. So I assumed I was going to come across 500 bodies strewn across the M11 motorway.
Oh, right.
So it was something of a relief to find that only, I think 4 people died, didn't they? There was a supernumerary on the cockpit.
Yeah, there was a ground engineer.
Ground engineer, okay. And but, you know, walking across the site, there was what I thought were human remains, you know, of people's heads. There was a whole consignment of wigs. And so that was a heart-stopping moment to come across all that. But, you know, we worked out, well, it was a failure of the attitude reference system. And although the electronics were sort of smashed to pieces and some of them had burnt, we were able to pin down the exact circuit card within one of the inertial navigation units that had failed. But the maintenance processes didn't allow that to be adequately diagnosed.
This has always been my fascination with, I mean, Steve will tell you, this whole air crash investigation has always intrigued me. I remember once I was at the branch, because I used to get there whenever I could, and I was invited to sit in the morning meeting and listen to what everybody's doing. It was a case of you sit in the corner, shut up and just listen. There's me, quite happy. And then I was talking to some of the people afterwards, and various things came up, and I was talking about it, and somebody said, this guy here reads our reports. And I think, you know, and my thing with it is this intense reverse engineering. So you've got this massive machine smashed to pieces over a huge area and burnt and stuff everywhere, and you unpick it to the point of going, that's what did it, you know. Well, that thing there is what did all of this. I love that process.
Well, it's I mean, the thing is, it's really it's applied logic.
Yeah.
You know,
but it's on a grand
it
scale,
can only be this. You know, symptoms that are only consistent with this happening.
Well, gentlemen, that is absolutely
okay.
Oh, that's
fantastic.
good.
Thank you very, very much. It's a real privilege.
You're welcome.
Thank you yeah. We'll get out there and let people have a look.
Yeah.
I decided to bring this journey to a close up here at Tundergarth, which is where the cockpit landed, just over there in that field. And you really have to come here to appreciate the scale of this disaster. It's quite a drive from the Memorial Garden up to Tundergarth. And it's been quite moving, quite emotional to make this little film with Steve and Andy. So I hope you've taken something from it. I certainly did. And thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon on something else.